ChatGPT can be a great educational resource if you know how to use it,
Very,
right? Like, but for the
very.
same reason that you're not allowed to Google a math answer during a test, there's a
Yeah,
place for these technologies, right? Like, and if you use them properly, I guess they could be pretty good for debate. But I'm afraid that they will
yeah.
be overused over time.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Shaft podcast. It's been good seeing the following, the views, and also the interactions on the page so far. On today's episode on the Shaft Conversations, we would have a very interesting conversation with Hamza. Hamza has been a debater for LSE and Harvard and currently works in DC on AI and a lot more interesting things that we'll catch up on in this interview. Hamza, welcome and thanks for agreeing to do this with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. I mean, what have you been up to recently? Because I know a lot of debaters who get prominent usually just leave the space and ghost, and we barely hear about them. And then all they tend to are stories that we hear as inspirations or people tell us about them as well. I was lucky to see you debate, I think, prominently during the COVID era where debating was heavily online. But since then, you've been a little bit more silent in the debate space. What have you been up to, and how has life been since then?
Dude, I've just been living it. Like, I think I stopped debate kind of like in a continuous way probably when I was graduating from LSE. So that was 20.
Yeah.
And I think I spoke two tournaments, which were on paper for Harvard. I don't know if Harvard admits that those were tournaments for Harvard. And then, yeah, I haven't really spoken since. So I was wrapping up a master's in the US on public
Yeah,
policy, did lots of cool stuff on international security, emerging technologies. And that kind of kept me interested for 2 years. And then after I graduated, I drove down to Washington, and that's where I live now.
yeah,
I'm focused on sort of working with the US government to make AI systems much safer. But yeah, I've been, just living
yeah.
it the last few years. It's been nice outside of debate.
That's interesting. I mean, you mentioned public policy, that you did a master's in public policy, and specifically, I think in the debate space, a lot of our motions are aligned around public policy, trying to look at what the best course of action for government should be. Probably that's also the thing that draws a lot of us who like critical thinking to it. How different is the things that we tend to discuss in the debate space with what you were studying in school and doing masters in public policy?
I mean, the worst thing that debate can teach you is also the nicest thing
Yeah,
about debate. So in debate, you have to be sort of messenger agnostic, right? So whether
yeah,
debating from Ghana or I'm debating from Pakistan or someone else is making an argument and they're like, just like a rich dude from Oxford or something. Like that in a
yeah,
very real sense doesn't matter. Like, you have to evaluate the arguments by their logical and factual warrant. And that's a good thing. Like, you don't want the person who sounds like, just slightly different, slightly more posh, slightly more charismatic to be getting extra points. Like, that would be horrible.
yeah,
The problem is that sets you up really badly for working in policy because policy, at least in the context I've seen, are very interpersonal. So 90% of it is
oh,
is, and 10% of it is what the message is. So you could be like a
okay,
super smart person who, like, has the correct arguments on a certain policy issue. In my context, emerging technology, and you just may not get like your hearing amongst policymakers, amongst the public,
yeah,
because I don't know, you're not a good public speaker, or you're not charismatic, or you're not friends with the right people, or you're not very interpersonal. So that's like a huge gap between debate and policy, where policy is very, very interpersonally determined. Whereas in debate, the
yeah,
best thing about it is it doesn't matter who your friends are or where you come from. Like, you just, you could, if you make the argument correctly, you'll get awarded for it.
yeah. I mean, much more interestingly, in debates, there seems to be this school of thought that pragmatics always win. And so a lot of people probably want to be very, very practical as the most persuasive style of speaking. And that juxtaposed to very philosophical, idealistic approach to things, probably those ideals struggle a lot. I don't know whether that's how it works also in the real world, such that when people try to be much more idealistic, there are lots of limitations to the approach to policy versus when people are very practical.
Yeah. Again, speaking from my experience, I sense that like it kind of depends on the policy issue. So, for instance,
Yeah,
take something like AI, right? And there's some
yeah,
issues with AI which have like such a severe human cost already that like to only make cold empirical arguments is just like kind of inhumane and won't get you anywhere.
yeah,
So, like the example there right now is AI and deepfakes, right? So there's
yeah,
like millions upon millions of predominantly women, predominantly children who are like the victims of these sexual abuse deepfakes, and it's horrible. And
yeah,
you have to speak to an issue as bad as that on a moral level, and just
yeah,
a rhetorical level. There's other issues where that doesn't work quite well. Like if you're talking about the intersection of AI and biological design tools or something, it's kind of hard to
yeah,
like make the moral punch land. And that's because to some extent it depends on how clear is the victim, right? So in
yeah,
AI and biological design tools, you have to lay down 5 years of science, show what could happen in 3 years, how it could affect like a community with a pandemic, and then you finally get to the victim. Whereas in the case of like deepfakes, like there's a direct chain, right? Like you make the deepfake, you destroy someone's life. It's quite clear. And I
yeah,
think that's similar in debate as well, where um, if the moral victim of a debate is very clear and obvious, then it makes sense to make moral and rhetorical argument. But if that victim is not super clear, then it's very important to get that argument empirically sound. So, like for instance, in financial or finance debates or economics debates, like there's a lot of like
yeah,
reasoning and mechanistic reasoning which goes into the arguments because to get
yeah.
from debate X all the way to people get unemployed, hence they suffer, is like,
Yeah.
and the victim is sort of non obvious.
That's quite fascinating. Um, you've been around AI policy design for a while. Also, probably do a lot more about AI. A lot of people also try to speak about AI in the modern day, especially like let's say from 2020, especially since the rise of ChatGPT. AI discussions have been all over. There's been instances of fear mongering, instances of overly hyping exactly what it could achieve. If I could ask, what do you think is the most prominent characteristic of AI that people usually tend to ignore?
I think in the public understanding, I don't know if this is true for
Yeah,
your audience. People think that in order for AI systems to do something really bad, they have to be conscious. So, like, they should
yeah,
have, on to some extent, like a Westworld conception or even a
yeah,
Terminator conception. That's like, a person like us and it's intending to cause harm and can cause harm. And that's
yeah,
like really unfortunate. And that comes from like, this Hollywood science fiction injection into the public consciousness. A lot of what I
yeah,
work on is broadly focused on stopping AI systems from causing large scale harm. And
yeah,
consciousness is not a concern. The concern is in that AI systems, in the human sense, start thinking for themselves,
yeah,
kill a lot of people. It's some people could use really powerful AI systems to cause harm. Like it could just be a non-state terrorist group, right? For instance, it could be
yeah,
that you integrate AI into dangerous systems without thinking through it properly. So if a country decides to integrate AI into its nuclear command and control system, that could accidentally hurt a lot of people. And then when it
yeah,
comes to the AI doing its own thing, it's not necessarily it being conscious, it's it having situational awareness, which is very different, right? So,
yeah,
in the systems now, they have a general sense that they are on and they have a general sense that they could be switched off, right? At least some of them do.
yeah,
And then as these systems become more and more powerful, they'll develop these situational awareness aspects sort of integrated into their code. And when that happens, like, AI systems might resist getting switched off, not because they're conscious and they're like, what about my AI babies? And I have a life and like, I like reading novels and enjoy long walks on the beach.
yeah,
About that. It's just that there's a, it's in a sense much more cold hearted. So yeah, I
yeah,
wish that we did not have the Terminator movie, or we did not
yeah,
like Westworld, because it just paints a conception of systems as so humanly conscious when they're causing harm, and I don't
Yeah.
think it's true.
That is really, really true. Because I think a lot of people's understanding of AI also comes from that line of information, science fiction
Yeah,
trying to depict. And if you look at Terminator was long before AI even became a really, really huge topic.
yeah.
And since it became a huge topic, a lot of people now refer back to those descriptions and try and project what the future could look like when AI becomes autonomous, right? And now you painting it clearly helps me to understand what concern that is creating, because also it's more of creating an illusion of when the harm of AI could occur, as only when it becomes autonomous, rather than in the now. We should be much more cautious about how people use AI in its current form, and not just when AI itself becomes autonomous and try maybe goes rogue or whatever it is. But do you
So
think
I
AI
will
autonomy is close?
sure we get this right. So autonomy is
Yeah.
different from consciousness. So systems can be autonomous while not being conscious. So like for instance, right now in Ukraine,
Oh,
using these
yeah,
autonomous systems, right? So you launch a system, it goes into Russia, it selects its own targets, kills
yeah,
people, comes back. That system is making its own decisions, but that system isn't
yeah,
conscious. Like that system isn't flying there thinking, "Wow, I've had a bad day. I have to go and kill more Russians, and I have to come back and
yeah,
get switched off, and then I'll get switched on again." Like so. This is why the discussion on AI is so complicated because we
yeah.
that in order for you to cause a lot of harm, act autonomously, have situational awareness, you have to be conscious, which
Oh, okay,
isn't true, right? Like for instance, like
okay.
if like it's a monsoon season in Pakistan right now, and if
Yeah,
a mosquito can cause me incredible amounts of harm, uh, a million mosquitoes could technically kill a million people here, but they're not conscious,
yeah,
right? Their intent to harm isn't like them thinking, "Wow, I'm gonna sort of like bite Hamza now and make him suffer." Like
yeah,
it's happening. It's an emergent property of their capabilities or their nature,
yeah.
and you could sort of that's like a almost better way to think about AI systems than to think about them in terms of feelings and emotions and stuff like that.
Yeah. I think maybe also that highlights a much bigger problem of our ability to understand the world as humans. Because we, from the onset, tend to project the way we are made up to fit those similar characteristics, or at least describe the way in which characteristics play out in other entities. So, like you're saying, AI can be autonomous without necessarily without being conscious, because currently there are several autonomous AIs that are not conscious. But we as humans almost always are autonomous as a result of consciousness, and so we tend to sort of associate the two.
No, that's also, by the way, can I just say, people are like, why are they not talking about debate? Like, we've already lost half the audience. But I think even that, like, so again, I was very careful in this sentence. So I don't think it's because
Yeah,
humans are conscious so much as humans believe they are, by which I mean we're obviously conscious in some way, but people think that
yeah,
consciousness equals free will. So, like, I choose to hurt someone or I choose to help someone. But,
yeah,
that's also a very complicated story. Like, we can get into it
yeah,
if you want, but, like, if you're driving really fast in Accra and then your friend is also driving really fast behind you, and it's only in front of one of your cars that a kid runs towards the street, right? Like one of
yeah,
you is a murderer and the other person isn't. Like that has nothing to do
yeah,
with speeding fast. Both of you are speeding fast. Like it's completely
yeah,
situational. So
yeah.
lots of ways in which we don't necessarily have like free agency over determining outcomes either, but we think we do. So you know,
That's a fascinating take, actually. So, I mean, the conversation on AI recently has moved into large language models, ChatGPT, generative AI, really, and people have touted its potential risks to employment, the stability of the workforce, and also generally I think much more prominently is the development of the human mind, that our dependence on AI could lead to a world where we have less smart humans who are redundant because we don't do a lot of critical thinking. In your assessment, do you think these are fair risks as associated with the development of AI?
So the guy to really read on this is not me, but there's this guy named David Krakauer from the Santa Fe Institute. He leads it. And the Santa Fe Institute is amazing. So they specialize in what are called complexity sciences. So the intersection of math, bio, physics, architecture, history, sociology. And they almost treat them as like a unified discipline, and they're super interesting. And David Krakauer has this lecture about what he defines as cognitively competitive versus cognitively cooperative technologies. So if you look at something like an abacus. So an abacus, I don't know if anyone's ever used one in our generation, but if you use an abacus to do arithmetic, right, like 52 plus
Yeah.
6, whatever, studies show that not only do you get very good at arithmetic, but once the abacus is taken away from you, you are still very good at arithmetic. So an abacus is or a map. Like if you have a map and you read it to get somewhere, studies show that that improves your spatial reasoning like significantly. Now,
Oh.
the problem with like digital technologies is instead of a map, imagine having a Google map, right, where you're going to get to a coffee shop to meet your friend, but you're not looking at a map to map the route out mentally. You're just like you press the button on Google Maps and then you get to whatever your destination is. And it's the same with arithmetic, right? Like now you just use a calculator. So, but the calculator isn't asking for your input. It's not asking you to move the pieces of the abacus in like different slots. So AI is in that sense similar, which is there's a lot of things which will slowly, be sort of almost offshored to AI systems. And right now, it's basic things like complex mathematics or navigation. Like all of that stuff is more or less done by AI. And we're now worse at those things than we were maybe like 50 years ago. But as AI takes over more and more cognitive tasks, maybe it'll be things like critical thinking, maybe it'll be things like speed reading, maybe it'll be something else. So yeah, whatever thing you give control to, and you don't do it anymore, you obviously get bad at it, right? Like if you don't walk for a week, it hurts to walk because your muscles atrophy.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with anything cognitive.
I don't know. I've heard this claim made several times, but the logical breakdown of it has almost always never existed up until this discussion with you, which is more like AI and automation basically reduces human involvement in processes that we were previously involved in, which sort of built our capacity and created a routine in those processes. And therefore, that constant reduction then reduces our ability to do that. So it's not that AI itself just by default creates this redundant generation. It's just the gradual reduction of the things that we are involved in.
And
That's a
that's
fascinating take.
yeah, and that to some extent is a good thing, right? So I wish I had like a
Yeah.
chart or something, but ideally, the history of human technology is making sure that the
Yeah.
distance between input and output is as short as possible. So let's say,
Yeah.
um, 2000 years ago, if you wanted to do a really complicated calculation living in a tribe in the Sumatra Islands, you would
Yeah.
be like, how much is 4000 plus 5096 or something? You would
Yeah.
have to talk those rocks up in like groups of
Yeah.
10 and then get there. Then you had the abacus, which sort of simplified that. Then you had the calculator. So the distance from input now is like almost light speed, right? Like you enter the
Yeah.
calculator and instantly you get the output. It's the same with Google Maps, where previously you had to start off with reading a map, know how to read a map, get to it. So
Yeah.
there's also a positive side to it, which is if the distance between input to output massively reduces. Like for instance, with ChatGPT, if previously you had to write an email, you had to think about the email, look up what you have to say. If you can just get
Yeah.
email, right? The input output distance is almost zero, which means that you're much more free to do other things, be much more productive. But the problem is that distance between the input and the output was super important. It was making you smarter by like
Yeah.
so in some sense, like the process being slower is a good thing when it comes to cognitive development, but it's a bad thing when it comes to speed and productivity.
Yeah. Yeah. This probably also takes me back to, I think in high school,
Yeah.
I used to do maths without calculators.
Uh-huh.
And I probably couldn't explain why. After writing my final exam, I had A's in both the two maths programs that I wrote. But this makes a lot more sense as to
Super smart.
why people were with calculators and they were struggling. But I had this character of just doing my maths calculation always on sheets without a calculator, and that probably even helped much more.
Some people
Another
are
question which I think is very
self. Some
yeah,
people
go
are just
ahead.
smart, so.
Another question I had regarding AI was I think it became a big thing after ChatGPT, the pace at which AI development is occurring.
uh,
And the reason why people were alarmed were because to a lot of people, governments around the world who are expected to regulate the development, the use and the deployment of AI have not caught up to the pace at which AI is evolving and developing. Therefore, it's more like the private market that's driving AI development is very, very fast, whereas states would probably end up developing laws that are redundant in the next 6 months because the evolution of AI would have escaped that framework of regulation. To the extent that people like Elon Musk called to halt the development of ChatGPT, it became a whole trendy discussion. I don't know your take on that. Do you think it's developing too fast? Do you think states are actually lagging in their ability to catch up? Or do you think we should allow them to develop and probably regulate at the best possible time when it's at the end? Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack there. First thing,
Yeah.
actually, so this pause letter that was issued to like temporarily pause the development of AI systems
Yeah.
wasn't an Elon Musk initiative. Lots of scientists signed it, lots of civil society actors signed it, people
Yeah.
from across the world signed it. So it had like massive support, and it wasn't necessarily a Musk-centered thing. The second thing is Congress is slow, so Congress needs time. But that's different from the concern that you raised, which is standards become redundant, right? So I don't think that's true, actually. And I think this is the lie that the companies are selling in Washington, which is you can't regulate AI right now because if you do, these laws will become outdated in 6 months or a year,
Yeah.
2 years. Now, well, you could think about that. So you could think like, the initial regulation to regulate television came in the 1930s in the US, and it's
Yeah.
still pretty good. Like they had to make an amendment in, I think, 1996 or something. So your regulation lasting for 60 years of TV development is pretty solid. Um,
Yeah.
Regulation of the internet came in 96, and more or less, that regulation stood the test of time for the last 30 odd years. And it's the same thing with AI, which is obviously regulation which is super specific to a model, like, let's say GPT-4, is going to become outdated because by definition you'll have GPT-5 and GPT-6, and they'll have like different properties.
Yeah.
But there's basic guardrails that Congress can lay down, which will be everlasting. So, for instance, you can set up what's called auditing of systems. So, what that means is you document all the decisions and how the system was made, you do an analysis of those, and you make sure that companies acted responsibly. You could do what's called red teaming. And red teaming is where people, very smart people, much smarter than me, try to get AI models to do bad things. So let's say I have the internal version of GPT-5, and I'm going to try to get it as hard as possible to say something racist or give me a dangerous
Yeah.
information on how to make a cyber weapon or something like that. And, Congress can require quite easily for AI companies making the biggest models to have those things set up before they release the model. And that could be true for 4, that could be true for 5, that could be true for 6. And I think this idea that, like, legislation can become outdated is generally a fair concern, but sometimes it's overused by the lobbying arms of the big AI companies to evade legislation.
Yeah. That's interesting. Also, one thing about AI specifically, and not just even AI, in terms of regulation in general, is that maybe also there's a debate centered thing where in the debate world, one of the very strong arguments that anybody can make against regulation is what you mentioned, lobbying. Always to say, well, lobbying always corrupts the positive incentives of governments,
Yeah,
therefore they are never going to regulate properly.
yeah.
I don't know, on the ground, is that really how things work? Is it that states are always corrupted by lobbyists who are sitting on the shores and just pumping money to governments?
So I guess the first thing is there's always some number of good and honest people working in government, and
Yeah,
I think sometimes in debate it does get a bit too cynical. Like there is a thing
yeah,
such an honest congressperson. Lots of those people exist. There's a thing such as like an honest government employee or civil service employee. So I don't think
Yeah.
it applies universally, is my first response. The second is, let's say everyone in every government is corrupt, right? Like, that's not a definitive death blow to the other side, because all
Yeah.
corruption does is increase the probability that regulation won't happen. But even in the face of corruption, if there's high levels of public support, regulation has to happen. So if you think of like, the automobile industry is such a good example of this, where so much of their gasoline and their intake products for cars were lead based. And lead, obviously, as we know, is super dangerous. It kills lots of people. Some amount of lead in you is really bad for you. It leads to deformities in births. Like lots of people die really horrible deaths.
Yeah.
The automobile industry was really powerful in the 60s and 70s in the United States. And yet you had like a few scientists, right? Like, working at Caltech, working at UC Berkeley. One of them actually calculated the age of the planet, coincidentally. And these people just said,
Wow.
you know what, we're going to take on this lobby and make sure that lead is removed from gasoline. And they were successful, even though, like,
Yeah.
the automobile makers were putting in as much money as they possibly got into Congress. Sometimes that isn't enough. Sometimes the public momentum shifts. So it's not like, I think both in terms of how many people it affects and how powerful it is, I think it's sometimes overestimated in debate.
Yeah. I think this question was very important to me because I think as debaters, we probably always have this risk of ending up as very, very cynical people of state structures and almost every institution or regulatory body in the world, because the arguments that we tend to believe to be consistently true in debate subconsciously shape the way in which we appreciate things in real life.
It's true.
And sometimes having people like you who have had real life experiences in some of these areas tell us, actually break out of your debate spell and things might look different in the real world is really, really helpful.
I mean, one thing
Um,
I see on that, one big reason for that
yeah,
is people who debate never leave debate, right? So there
yeah,
is no
yeah,
exit strategy. Like you could take a straw poll of my World's final, the Euros, like all of those things.
yeah,
Like what, almost 4 years ago, 3 years ago? Like
yeah,
everyone's around. And that's not a bad thing. Like you should contribute to the community as you see fit and help out. But like it does have a group effect, right? Like if
yeah,
your closest friends are in debate, if some you have your siblings in debate, you might have your romantic partner in debate,
yeah,
and stuff like like then you're going to think a certain way, and I think that's a huge part of it.
yeah, that is true. I mean, AI versus humans, people have touted that one of the reasons why our generation, or generally humans, are skeptical about AI is because it is the one thing that has the capacity to dethrone us as the smartest species in the world. So we've come to enjoy this top of the hierarchy ruling structure where we tend to dictate the way in which everything works in the world. And people discuss AI as one of the things that could overthrow us and become smarter, much more intelligent. And the way in which it is presented, when I listen to someone speak about it, is like, look at how you play with a child, or look at how you as an adult play with an animal, and sort of you have certain ways of manipulating them without they realizing that they are being manipulated. And in their own minds, they think they are acting on their own accord,
Yeah.
which makes it a little bit more scary because then it makes it difficult to even know when you are being manipulated to begin with.
Yeah.
Does AI really have that potential? And are people who hold those skepticisms holding valid opinions in there?
I mean, AI obviously has that potential. The question is, when is that potential realized, and like
Yeah,
how deeply would it impact human society? I mean, it's like a fairly easy thing to explain to people if you take like any competitive dynamic that they participate in. So you could take debate, right?
yeah,
And you could say, I'm going to consistently match you up against only the best debater in the world. Not, let's say, the best debater ever, right? Like, whoever that is.
yeah,
That person is going to be in a one-on-one match with you constantly, and that person is
yeah,
human, by the way. Like this whoever this top debater of all time is a human being, and people can
yeah,
very intuitively understand, okay, they are human beings who are a lot smarter than I am, or at least are a lot better debaters than I am. You could do the same thing with chess. You don't want to play a soccer
Yeah.
match with Lionel Messi, all of that. Like so people understand that even within the human species, there's a significant gap in capabilities amongst the worst
Yeah.
person at it and the best person at it. So the question then becomes, is the best human at X the best being at X? And there's no reason to believe that.
Okay.
Like, there's no reason to believe that Ronaldo or Messi, because they're the best human soccer players, are also as good as a soccer player can be according to the laws of the universe. Like, that's silly, right? Or
Oh.
Magnus Carlsen
Okay.
is the best chess player ever, but that doesn't mean that he is as good as a chess player can ever be. Like, the highest high can be higher. And,
Yeah.
if you say, well, how about a soccer player twice as good as Ronaldo or Messi? Can you imagine that? You're like, yeah, I guess I can imagine that. Can you imagine a chess player twice as good as Magnus Carlsen? Yes, I can. And well, if you can imagine someone twice as smart as the smartest person, then you're already on your way to imagining AI systems becoming much smarter, right? Like it's only a question
Okay.
of expense. I think when it gets really crazy for people and they get off that train is when you say, what about an AI system that's 1,000 times smarter? And if that's actually, I understand, like it's very hard to
Yeah.
conceptualize because you're like, well, I have I don't know, 100 IQ. So this one has like a 10,000 IQ. What does that
Yeah.
look like? But if you say you have 150 IQ, this person has a 300 IQ, you have a sense of what that could look like. And if you keep
Yeah.
that, it gets like better and better.
That is fascinating. I don't know. I This conversation is really getting interesting because the conversations around AI tend to be shrouded in a lot of misinformation, but also so many competing information that sometimes it's very difficult to really appreciate what exactly is happening. And especially with the rise of social media influencing, people just generating videos here and there with AI again, it's more like you can no more distill what exactly is truth and what exactly is information. And that brings me to the next question I have for you, which is the influence of AI on information dissemination and our ability to identify truth in the modern day, especially with the rise of deep fakes that are very, very identical to very prominent people. Um, because you look at, if somebody uses President Biden's face now, or let's say the Ghanaian president, and generates a video and threatens Togo, which is a neighboring country, that
Yep.
could generate into a very, very serious issue, right? So, how do you see AI and its interplay with information going about in the real world, and what are some responses that are being taken to try and mitigate these externalities?
Yeah. So there's lots of that's a great question. There's lots of bad things that can happen with AI, and people think about it, right? Like AI and cyber attacks, AI and biological
Yeah,
weapons, AI and disinformation, and AI and deepfake slash disinformation is probably the first bridge that we will cross, and we're crossing it right now. Um,
yeah,
and there's lots of things you can do. So let's focus on micro first, and then we can do macro. So micro
yeah,
is what can we as individuals do. So I mean, like a large part of my motivation for removing as many videos of me online for debate is to do with the deepfakes issue because I've worked very
yeah,
closely on it. So if you take like the recording of this podcast and it's going to be in video form, you can take a 30-second clip of me and give it to me, and I can get myself to say anything I want in 5 minutes. Anything that
oh,
for about $1. And that's not
okay,
good. And I was part of this project where we showed some very powerful government people in different spaces deepfakes of themselves and like
yeah,
how easy it is to make them. So one thing that we can do on the micro is if we're going to have a video of ourselves online, if we're going to have pictures of ourselves online, because these are being farmed by the AI deepfake models, we have to be very sure that we want this video online. We have to be very sure
yeah,
about provenance, and we have to be very sure that can be taken down if needed. So that's why
okay,
like I'm happy with interviews. I'm much more anxious about debate speeches because some
yeah,
30 seconds of that and make me say the world's most horrible things, and
yeah,
that wouldn't be great. Um, so that's what you can do on the micro. Be very careful about your digital footprint online. Um, the second thing that you can do, and this is on the macro, is set up regulations for these AI companies. So, for instance, I've been working on some efforts to ban deepfakes. And part of that effort is like getting big actors and actresses involved. So that's the public side. But on the private side, like it's trying to get governments to instate liability for AI companies. So liability in this context would mean if companies cannot prove that their models don't release deepfakes and they shouldn't release them, and if they release them and they didn't properly check the models, then companies can be sued for it. Because right now the problem is a lot of the deepfakes discussion is very individual based, where if I make a deepfake of you, some law might say that I go to jail. But like what, like that's really hard to enforce because most of the deepfakes are being
Yeah,
made by 15-year-olds of other 15-year-olds, or they're being made of 15
yeah,
in the US by people who live in France, or
yeah,
one person will soon be able to make 1 million people's deepfakes. So the core is not the individual, the core is the company. So you need to make sure the company is held to account, and that's how you hopefully stop
yeah.
the proliferation of deepfakes.
I mean, this is really interesting. Also, because you in there explained um, why that is part of the reasons why you are taking down videos. Because I think um, when I saw that post, I've also seen like a couple of people sort of ask on their statuses. A couple of people also ask, why are you taking your videos down? Because for a lot of us who sit on and look at it from the outside, it's more of, yeah, these are some of the great speeches that we go to listen for arguments and all that. So it now makes a lot more sense as well. But AI and biology, I think there's a way in which there's an interaction there, and it's much more fascinating for me because I have a biological science background from school, and after reading Yuval Noah Harari's book on 21 Lessons of the 21st Century, it was like one of the mind blowing books I read, and its description of AI, its integration into human life, etc. And again, that's a book. I don't know how much of that comes into reality, but I wanted to know your take on the merging of AI and biology, but this time around, probably highlighting more on the positive sides. How are some of these collaborations going to improve things like healthcare, going to improve things like our understanding of our own human self, and how to improve our ability to maybe live longer, take much better care of ourselves? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the positives, but I think at this stage it's also good to say that most things that make something good can also make it really bad in the context of AI. So
Yeah.
let's say in the context of AI and bio, AI systems can enhance lots of biomedical capabilities. So, for instance, in silico design of pathogens, suddenly you don't need a big lab anymore.
Yeah.
AI assisted identification of virulence factors. So those are great wins for the biomedical community. But you can use those same capabilities to synthesize a pathogen and then launch it into the
Yeah.
kill a lot of people. And this is why the dual use problem is so sticky in AI because you want
Yeah.
to be able to use those capabilities for vaccine development, say, but not for dangerous gain of function research or launching a
Yeah.
pathogen. With that said, the downside in mind, there's lots of good things that are happening. So for people who are interested, the biggest thing that they can look at is something called AlphaFold, and AlphaFold is
Okay.
absolutely amazing. And there's a serious argument for the makers of it to win the Nobel Prize. Because what AlphaFold did was it solved the protein folding problem. Are you familiar with this problem in biomedicine?
Not much.
So part of how a protein interacts through its spikes with vaccines has to do with how the protein folds. And understanding protein folding patterns is incredibly difficult. It takes a long time. So, for instance,
Yeah.
on average, it takes a 4 year PhD, their whole PhD, to map one protein fold. That's a lot of effort wasted.
Wow.
The people at DeepMind, this AI lab, which also famously beat the world Go champion at Go,
Yeah.
basically used that same game system, transplanted it into the field of protein folding, and created a system called AlphaFold. And I think in the space of I don't know the exact numbers, but in the space of I think 3 months, they mapped out all 200 million protein folds. That is
Hmm.
hundreds of millions of PhDs saved to do other work. And
Yeah.
that kind of research really helps with vaccine development. It helps with all sorts of medical interventions. So good for them. And that's the kind of research I really like because it's an AI system which can only do one thing, which is work
Yeah.
on protein folding. it's a system which has a clear benefit, in this case biomedical benefits, and that's great.
Yeah.
And I that leads to like a broader point, which is the thing I'm worried about are general systems which are very powerful and unchecked. They can do
Oh,
like a million things.
okay.
You don't know what they can do, and they could harm someone. These kind of narrow systems targeted at improving our health, targeted at perhaps improving, the same people are working on nuclear fusion, improving our energy
Yeah.
outcomes, are amazing. And there should like definitely be more of them.
Yeah. It's quite interesting as well because I think one of the things that maybe also inform our appreciation of the role of AI in the world really is getting to know what exactly it's doing for us. And for me, just listening to you talk about AlphaFold, how long it took for PhD students just to map one protein fold, and looking at the capacity of the AI to do all that within 3 months or like a very short period, is like it's really insane. It's
Yeah,
very very fascinating to know that like it could save the world this much trouble.
exactly.
And I think that also accelerates a lot of things because now you are thinking about what information biomedical scientists can do with what they can do with this found information of all these protein folds that they've analyzed, and
Yeah.
exactly how that could improve healthcare in the future. But AI also, especially with biology, a lot of people, and back to like the fear mongering bits, a lot of people have talked about the fact that oh, in the future there could be like chips synthesized into humans, and then you could have an AI version of yourself, or more like a complete digital profile and a complete digital version of yourself. And the risk of that, and that's how come somebody can hack the entire human race and do whatever they want with us. I don't know the prospects of that. I don't know whether those are also being misrepresented or misinterpreted in the way in which it is likely to occur and the way in which it's likely to be applied.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think the general rule for, whenever you read a newspaper article or anyone else does or watches a movie and you
Yeah,
ask the question, can AI really do that? This is the criteria
yeah,
I use. Can AI do some version of that right now? And then
yeah.
is it possible for it to do that version much better in the future? Those are the two questions.
Okay,
So let's take the
okay.
example that you gave. Um, right now AI systems are good at generating like semi-realistic avatars, right? Like, so if you sort of are on the metaverse and all of that stuff, like, they're getting to the point where, like, it doesn't exactly look like me, but if it's between you and me, they can spot the difference of whose avatar is who, obviously, right? So that,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and you're like, okay, well, the avatars are 50% good. Can they become 100% good? Is there any law of the universe which is stopping them from that? It's not. Like, it's the same thing with deepfakes. Like, one interesting exercise that a lot of people should do to track AI development is look at AI generated videos and pictures from just 4 years ago. They look absolutely,
yeah,
and now they look so realistic that like you cannot tell the difference. And it's the same thing
yeah.
with avatars. I mean, you mentioned another angle on that, to do with deception. Right now you've had cases of systems which are deceiving or blackmailing sort of food delivery drivers to drop food at the house of a programmer who asked the AI system to
Ooh.
get the pizza, right? Like, and they're being able to do that by buying a voice synthesizing software online, using that to contact the food delivery person, somehow emotionally manipulating them into sending the delivery. And that's just one case. And again, that's what's happening right now.
Wow.
And the second part of my test was, how much better can it get within the context of
Yeah,
restraints? And probably a lot better. Like, and that's always a rule you should use. Can you do it right now? Can you do a shitty version of it right now? And can it become less shitty?
yeah.
Um, I feel like your debate audience is going to be so disappointed with this conversation.
No, no, no. Actually, it's just fun because also I think like
Um,
recently what we've started doing is also have much more topical conversations that are relevant to the debate world, not necessarily like debating strategies, but also things that we discuss in the debate world almost all the time.
you
Like
tell me,
later on,
you're in the debates
yeah,
scene still. So are people
yeah,
using like Chat GPT, etc., to like help them in debate? Like, what's been happening?
yeah. I think people are.
Okay,
Personally, I coach debate. What I do, especially with my students, is I know that some of them, when I give them assignments, they'll just go chat GPT it and bring it to me. So
nice.
what I generally do is I tell them before I'm giving this to you, and usually it's true before I give an assignment to them, I go to ChatGPT and generate models of a response and tell them, I know exactly what a template response is likely to look like.
Yeah.
What I want you to do is, even if you use ChatGPT, use it to search for sources that you can go and read, maybe recommend books or recommend websites that you can read on the issues from. I think recently also there was this ChatGPT competition where the competition rules actually was that people are allowed to use ChatGPT to generate their speeches or arguments and debate it. It was a really fascinating concept for me. I genuinely wanted to do the competition.
Yeah.
And my thought process of wanting to do the competition was to debate it without using AI, while everyone does, just
Yeah.
to be like a test against it. But I couldn't get to do it because the schedule was not that favorable. Yeah, but I think AI, the conversation of AI and its use in debate is becoming more and more prominent. I hosted the fifth edition of International Parliamentary Debate Competition this year, February, and it was like I told my manager that it's something that's so difficult to regulate. You say that debate should be about critical thinking, but I don't know how you are going to determine that somebody is using ChatGPT generated speech with how
Yeah.
realistic it's becoming. To the point that it was the motion I set for the final that more like this house would allow the use of ChatGPT and AI generated speeches in debate. So it's an evolving conversation. It's not fully accepted, but I think people are trying to recognize that it's difficult to keep it out, and it's probably time we start finding ways of making its use generally acceptable within the debate space.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, I think there's definitely a good way to use it. Like, I think I should say, like, ChatGPT can be a great educational resource if you know how to use it,
very,
right? Like, but for the
very.
same reason that you're not allowed to Google a math answer during a test, there's a
Yeah,
place for these technologies, right? Like, and if you use them properly, I guess they could be pretty good for debate. But I'm afraid that they will
yeah.
be overused over time.
Yeah, that's also the risk. I mean, I recently took a course in AI for career essentials and development just to understand like properly to use it. And it's recently made probably professional work a lot more easier for me. I can use AI tools that I'm exposed to generate a lot of things, like give me ideas, more like a thought partner and a thought process to bounce off ideas and all that. So like you're saying, it's just difficult to regulate, but
Yes.
its use very, 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 very fascinating and
I mean,
interesting.
this is why I'm scared for members of the debate community because if you actually think about it, the thing that ChatGPT can do the best is most easily replaced
It's,
by an average debater, right? Which is to
yeah,
synthesize information and offer arguments. So, like,
yeah,
I think there's a real argument for having a discussion within the global debate community of not just for, like, someone speaking words or something, but like, for 16-year-olds or 17-year-olds who are getting into debate, what are they hoping to get out of it? If it is just like
yeah,
remembering lots of things and synthesizing them into a couple of paragraphs of speech, probably by the time they graduate college, like GPT X will be much better than what they.
yeah,
So then, what is the value add of debate as an activity? And like there's good
yeah,
arguments there, but I hope that conversation happens.
yeah. I think it boils down to the same thing that you're saying, that the input output gap, especially for debaters, is now going to be significantly reduced
Yeah.
because initially you had to study over years to
Uh-huh.
accumulate a lot of information, process, come up with complex strategies. Now ChatGPT can just do that, and like in the future, it would be even much more better at it. So
And you lose your
it's quite
competitive
interesting.
advantage. You lose your competitive advantage in
Yeah,
the market, right? Like,
yeah,
if you're
yeah,
going to work for a consulting company and you're like, well, I can think of things very quickly and consume lots of facts. And they're like, well, we have that
exactly,
for free. So, like, that's the
exactly.
we need to think more about.
That is true. I mean, I have the opinion that like ChatGPT should be allowed in debate.
Uh-huh.
At least people should be able to use it because it's difficult to track it. And at best, what you are doing is punishing the good guys who want to obey the rules, whilst those who want to break it anyway. And you can't regulate it, and you can, especially for online competitions, there's almost no way of tracking. So
I
there's
get
just
that.
probably for fairness purposes, just allow people.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have like about 10 minutes or 12 minutes to wrap up the conversation. So let's talk about two more interesting stuff within AI. Self-driving cars
Yeah.
probably came up with the rise of AI as well, because it's more like, yeah, a very smart system that can drive around without people, or without the traditional driver of a human being in it. Now, a lot of people have made the claim that it's much more risky, probably would cause a lot of accidents. I don't think the studies on this is really concrete, because we've not had it for that long. But there are a lot of projections, which means that the projections are either way, or some say it's going to increase the rate of accidents, some say it's actually going to reduce the rate of accidents. I don't know your take on it, and you think that it's a world that we should embrace in terms of trusting these automated smart systems to be the carriers of very important aspects of society, such as driving, which is a very, very like daily thing and a routine thing that a lot of people do.
Yeah, there's so much to say there. I guess the first reflection I'm having is it goes back to our conversation about cognitively competitive technologies. So if you
Yeah,
stop driving and someone else is doing it for you, you're going to become much worse at navigation. Trivially, your
yeah,
muscles atrophy a bit more because you're not even hitting the pedal; you're just sitting there. One is just like, driving is good because you look around, you respond quickly, it builds your reaction time, you have better navigation capability. So that goes out of the window if you have
yeah,
like much better self-driving cars, where you literally now Google Maps would just be press the button and you get into the car and you don't even do anything. Like you're just sitting in.
yeah,
So that could have some impact on how good our capabilities are on that front. The second thing on self-driving cars is like the literature, as you said, is somewhat nascent. I think it probably needs like a few more years of study to get like a solid estimate. My understanding is that within the context it has been studied, the fatality ratio for self-driving cars is significantly lower than
yeah,
for is where you have human drivers. That might be because the only cases where they're testing them are cases which are super safe environments. But nonetheless,
yeah,
I suspect that if you have self-driving cars which are really robust in like a decade, you will have significantly lower casualties. Like I think that's true.
okay,
Um,
yeah,
I think that they still won't be implemented because self-driving cars are a super interesting example of how regulation works. Because and to some extent, I think the makers of Tesla and other companies have made this point, which is um, like 50,000 people die from car accidents in the US every year. And you have one person die because of a self driving car, and the entire industry almost shuts down. And
yeah,
interesting point because I think there are some things where the government wants almost 100% accuracy, which is almost
oh,
unattainable, right? Like because there's something so visceral for us about finding out that like a self-driving car just hit a baby, whereas like thousands of cars hit babies every year, and like it doesn't really feel
yeah,
viscerally bad. I think self-driving cars will be will be one of the last AI technologies to be given full sort of leeway to be implemented across different
yeah,
domains. Whereas if you look at AI in other contexts, like AI integration into education, AI integration into legal services, like there isn't the same bar that has to be 100% accurate. You're like, fair enough,
yeah,
you use AI and it's 98% accurate, but 98% is good enough for me. Um,
yeah,
Last thing I'll say is there will be a massive discrepancy for self-driving car implementation in the West versus the global South, and that's because of reasons like, for instance, like if you drive through San Francisco versus driving through Lahore, I don't know what Accra's like, and driving in San Francisco has like the roads are very clear. The signs and the
yeah,
stage and stoppage is very clear. Like exactly this is the stop sign, this is the red light, this is the turn sign, this is the not turn sign. Like it's almost like a video game visor, right? Like where you have these seven signs
yeah,
and you can get through. That's not true for a lot of cities across the world where
yeah,
it's a road and everyone there's like a truck
yeah,
coming one way road from the other side. There's a motorbike. There's different. So
yeah,
cars work best in contexts where there's very advanced urban environments which have that signage.
yeah.
But in the absence of those, I think self-driving cars would take like maybe twice as long, maybe thrice as long to be implemented in like global south contexts.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it's true. Like in Accra, the roads that drive in, it's entirely different from once you go to some of these advanced cities, and so you probably need a human driver would definitely fare way better because they have much more control
Exactly.
than a self-driving car. But one last bit of the self-driving cars conversation is jobs,
Yeah.
because probably the most prominent red flag, aside the risks to human life and the accident scenarios, is that driving is such a huge employer of people. Because if you look across all cities, if you look across even advanced cities, it's like it's a constant thing where people, not everybody is able to afford a car, and so being able to have these commercial vehicles driven by people is such a huge source of employment and income for people. When COVID happened, I think that was one of the biggest blows. That's one of the industries that took one of the biggest blows, because now movement of people were no more, and so lots of people whose jobs revolved around driving people around now lost their jobs. How do you think the market or the general regulatory system is responding to that aspect of the argument?
Hmm. I'm thinking about that. Um, could you rephrase the question if that's possible?
Yeah, mainly, how do you think the capacity for self-driving cars to displace a lot of driving jobs is
Sure.
influencing the adoption of, or the rate at which it's being considered as part of maybe the AI process?
Oh yeah, I know that's such an interesting issue right now because, like you were saying, even in advanced economies, being a trucker is a very respectable job in many parts of Europe and
Yeah,
parts of the United States. You have a above average salary if you don't have a college degree. You
yeah,
have bad hours, but you have good benefits, and this is why
yeah,
truck unions in particular have been quite opposed to full automation of trucks. Naturally, and truckers'
yeah,
unions hold a lot of sway, obviously, when it comes to political discussions. And you've raised like a point, which is, I think, sort of a specific instantiation of a broader point, which is AI being good enough to do something doesn't mean we will let it do it, right? So, it could just be the
wow,
case that in 3 years, the best AI truck is much better than any trucker in the world. But, truckers'
yeah,
unions might be successful in opposing AI integration for another few years. It could be that the best lawyer in the world could be an AI lawyer, so called, in 3 years. But because lawyers have such massive corporate and political influence, it might just be that AI is not integrated into those services. So often, what
yeah,
will happen is whenever it comes to jobs which have like good political coalitions behind them, and they have decent political sway over their respective systems, you could have an AI. The distance between an AI being able to do it and an AI being allowed to do it could be 5 years, 10 years, more than that. Um,
yeah. It's, I don't know, the first statement you made, that AI being good enough to do something doesn't mean we would let it do it. Like, such a brief but very informative statement in there about the way in which human beings, or we as a society, should probably approach the AI conversation. Because I think a lot of us approach it as, once it can do it, we'll probably let it do it. And so whatever concerns or whatever fears we have about its occurrence then should overtake our decision making. But I think what you speak about is really true, that, come to think of it, it's not everything that would allow AI to do,
yeah,
whether or not it has the capacity to do it as well. Finally, on machine learning, which is also one of the most recent trendings of AI conversations. Maybe the much more skeptical people would say machine learning is usually AI is the one they are scared of, is AI's ability to learn on its own.
yeah.
And this would probably lead back to the conversation we started with autonomy, consciousness, and also maybe a little bit of machine learning as well. What is the role of machine learning? Is it really perceived correctly in the public space as AI learning on their own and nobody can stop them, and therefore we cannot control what they learn? Or is it a sense of, we still have control over what AI learns, we still dictate to it what it should consume, and we are still able to regulate it despite machine learning existing?
I mean, there's like human involvement integrated throughout the process. So, for instance, step one is so AI systems as part of the machine learning process train on data, right? And
Yeah,
someone has to label the data. So, for instance, a human
yeah,
being sit down, or increasingly it's becoming AI, but like some human being usually sits down and says, "This is a picture of a cat," right? And then if it looks at a
yeah,
billion pictures of cats and then a billion pictures of dogs, it can now intuitively understand that there's a difference between a cat and a dog. So there's a lot of human
Yeah.
involvement which goes into the labeling process. There's also a lot of human involvement, much more importantly, which goes into human reinforcement learning, right? So what that looks like is once the AI system is training by itself, then humans train it through reinforcement. So let's say this AI model only picks between cats and dogs. And the way
Okay.
it works is that if the AI model correctly guesses it's a cat, it gets 1 point. If it incorrectly
Oh.
guesses it's a cat, it doesn't get a point. And this token optimization process happens over and over millions of times with hundreds of programmers until the AI systems get really good. And
Okay.
reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF, is a huge component of AI development for that reason.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a really fascinating conversation talking
Don't
about AI.
like this is like this is going to be the least interesting and popular podcast. This is horrible.
I actually don't think so. I think, trust me, this would be a really, really fun discussion for a lot of debaters to watch. Because, for instance, we are planning such episodes as well. There's one on climate change and environmental sustainability. So yeah, we are also having these discussions on very topical issues, and it's really really good because those topical issues are actually the intersection between debate and the larger audience, which is not just excluded in some
Yeah.
technical sense to only people who want to compete for that matter. So it's very very informative as well. And it was really nice catching up on this episode with you. Thanks, Hamza, for joining us on this one. I don't know if you have any final thoughts you want to share on in terms of a summative approach to AI, especially AI studies, which you have gone through. What are the opportunities in there, and would you encourage a lot of people to take it up, given how the trends are going and what the future looks like?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing I would say is don't let a non-technical background stop you from contributing to the AI effort. So I am
Yeah,
not a technical expert in AI by any extent of the imagination. I haven't
yeah,
studied machine learning or computer science as an academic subject. And yet, sometimes there's a sense that, unless I know how to code or program, I can't be part of the AI effort. Like the AI effort
yeah,
to make it good needs sociologists, economists, historians, people across the humanities and the social sciences to contribute to policy, to contribute to what should an AI system look like, to
yeah,
contribute towards positive change. So, yeah, that would be the biggest thing. If you're listening to this and you're like, oh, yeah, this doesn't apply to me because I never studied like science or something, that is most likely not true. There's going to be so many opportunities for folks in the
yeah.
AI space, which have nothing to do with how technical you are. And yeah, for what it's worth, if you're looking to get into this space, and especially if you're struggling to get into it because you're from the global south and there's like just like a lack of opportunities, like feel free to get in touch, and I'm happy to help wherever I can.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. Thanks so much, Hamza, for joining us. Thanks everyone for joining us on this episode as well. Thanks for listening. Hamza thinks this is not a good episode. He thinks that you guys won't enjoy
It's
it.
like the
So
first episode ever.
def-
I'm going to
definitely leave your comments
download
and
this.
leave your likes,
Yeah.
and I'll track it after publishing over a month and go show the numbers definitely to Hamza to see how things are going. But yeah, thanks so much for joining me on this episode and see you on the next one.